gentlemen, welcome to
our third meeting of our winter season for 2024-2025. This is a joint meeting between the Tweeddale Society and the Archaeological Society of Peebles. And we have a really interesting speaker tonight. Jane is, by academic background, a geneticist, having studied and taught at Stanford and Edinburgh. But in fact, tonight, she's talking about a very important period, historical period, of the late medieval period, in quite a remote part of the borders. And we're going to hear about some of the communities, some of the trials and tribulations of the survival of the inhabitants of the area around Newcastleton in the borders. Jane has asked me to express quite strongly today that her interest in archaeology and history, which we're going to hear about, is through a real passion for these subjects. She is not a trained archaeologist, she's not a trained historian, but in my experience, quite often these are the most interesting speakers, because actually they bring a passion to the subject as opposed to an academic slant. So we're very privileged to have Professor Jane Bauer with us tonight, who's come all the way from her 2,500 acre farm in the borders to talk about the really fascinating history of this medieval period in the borders. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for calling for that nice introduction, emphasising that I'm not a historian, not an archaeologist, and very much going up a learning curve about the history and archaeology in the area that I'm talking about tonight here. The 12 Towers of Rule. It's a catchy title, isn't it? And that's actually why we chose it. It's a community-led project. It's still ongoing, exploring the history and archaeology of the Valley of Rulewater and its environs. And I will shortly show you where Rulewater Valley is, because I suspect most people don't know. It all came about because when the campaign for Scottish Borders National Park core team were sitting around thinking about what should we do to explain to people what a national park can do for an area. And we thought, well, what sort of project can we do to say this is the kind of thing a national park can do? We don't have any money, and we don't have any relevant expertise. So what are we going to do? And we started with a project about, what would we do a project about? And then Robert Bailey, young Robert, said, how about the 12 Towers of Rule? And everyone turned and said, what? The 12 Towers of Rule? What's that? And that, of course, is the ideal thing for a project. You must have a catchy title and you've got to have a good story. So we had the catchy title. Then this problem arose of the good story. Now, one of our problems was that we were not ourselves historians or archaeologists. So we had to persuade other people to come and help us with this. So we got together what we called the 12 Towers team. Richard Strathy, who sadly died in the process of the project, Roger Curtis of Historic Environment Scotland, who lived in the area that we're going to look at, and who's an expert on old buildings in particular, but again is very knowledgeable about the area he lives in, the Valley of Rulewater. Phil Richardson and Kieran Manchin, we managed to persuade Archaeology Scotland to become interested and to let this become part of their Adopt a Monument programme, for which they had some funding. Then Keith Elliott of Scottish Borders Council, who's somewhere in the audience here tonight, and it was critically important to making sure that everything was done right. myself and my husband Geoffrey Colby, who were in the campaign core team, Alan Bailey, who's in the campaign core team, and also very heavily involved in the future of Bedrule Kirk, which is part of the story, and a whole lot of others. And there's so many others who volunteered and helped that I haven't been able to put the names up because it would take up the whole time. But to all these people out there, our debt is considerable. Now, just to take you where we are, there is Howick, there is Jedburgh, and here is Rulewater, this blue line running up. And there's some interesting names there. Ruberslaw Hill, which is the most striking hill in the area, and then Bedrule, where Bedrule Kirk is, and Holrule, another important one, Abertrule, all important places, Bonchester Bridge, and have we got any others on this map? Lantern is important to the story as well. So that's it on a regular map. Timothy Pont actually made a map of Teviotdale between 1583 and 1596. And this is the Rulewater part of that map. And it's not terribly easy to make out, but it is very helpful when you study it closely. A lot of these place names and these buildings are part of the story. Oops, sorry. No, let's see. Oh, we're going the wrong way. Why am I going that way? No. There we are, we're back again. This is just a schematic map of the valley to give you a better idea of it. All these little marks, these little circles, are where we think the 12 towers were. And we don't know all of them for sure. Some of them we know for sure, and I'll go into that in a minute, but we don't know all of them. That's part of the mystery, which is part of what makes it continuingly interesting. Now let's see, I'm going to go in the right direction if I go this way. Yes. So, you need to have a good story with a good title if you're going to engage people's interests. We had no resources, but a good story and a catchy title as a starting place if you want to attract people's interest and if you want to raise some funding to do simple things and more and less simple things. The title, The 12 Towers of Rule, actually came from a book by George Tancred of Weems in 1907, which was about this Valley of Rulewater and its people. And in it, he refers to the 12 Towers of Rule, which were devastated in 1545 during the rough wooing. Between 1543 and 1551, there was a period known as the rough wooing, which many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of, when Henry VIII wanted to get his hands on Scotland, and Scotland didn't want to be caught, basically. Henry had a son at that point, young Prince Edward, and he approached the Scots lords and said, I would like my son to be betrothed to your infant queen, Mary Queen of Scots. The Scots lords were not enthusiastic about that idea at all, and this set in store this very turbulent period when Henry VIII was trying to take over Scotland, ultimately unsuccessfully. In 1545, in February, there was a rare success of the Scots at Ancram Moor. And this so enraged Henry VIII that he summoned his brother-in-law, the Earl of Hertford, and told him to devastate Tweeddale and Teviotdale, teach the Scots a lesson. And in fact, the Earl of Hertford, who later became the Duke of Somerset, took an army of 12,000 men and 4,000 horse up over the borders to Scotland. Now, I'm just saying, I'm not in the right order here. Let me get the next one. And we tried to find out about this, you can actually find on the web the letters and papers of Henry VIII. And don't try to read this. I'll read a little out and just say why it's important. In the course of trying to find out about these 12 towers that were burnt, we found a couple of letters, one from John Elder, an official who was here in Scotland, to an official of Henry VIII, Paget, which is an absolutely stunning letter. In it, he describes how the Earl of Hertford arrived and then how he devastated hundreds and hundreds of towns, villages, farms, 5 abbeys, towers, everything. I'll just read a little bit. The Earl of Hertford, Lieutenant General in the North, passed the River of Tweed 2 miles above Wark on the 9th of September 1545. The army numbered 16,000, 12,000 were footmen, 4,000 horse. And then he goes on this great list of what they did for 2 weeks. Every day they devastated another area. And at one time, and to spur them, these 36 places were burnt and razed on the River of Tweed. The Abbey town and Watermill of Kelso, the Abbey and town of Melrose, the Abbey and town of Drybrook, Darnach, Gotside, Dialtown, Overtown, on and on and on. And each day he lists dozens and dozens of towns, farms, and other places that were devastated, including these 5 abbeys that we all know. At the end of 2 weeks, my Lord Bernts turned due east towards Teviotdale and devastated the Rulewater Valley. But then, that done, his lordship rejoined the army, camped at Lady Kirk, alias Setlington, and on Wednesday, 23rd September, after making 3 nights in token of his triumph, departed to Norham. See, they all got on their horses and walked and went south after 2 weeks. And in a later letter to Henry VIII, he explains there isn't going to be need for much garrison in Scotland because the borders are absolutely devastated and there's no food for the winter. It's a stunning letter. So that we took as that was the story, and it was too much of a story, but the bit about Rulewater, we thought we can focus down on these 12 towers, try to work out a bit of what was it like for people. And what actually was damaged in Rulewater Valley? Can we pin it all down? Can we map this out? What was destroyed? Who was living there? How were they living? So, let's go on. Here we are. An almost identical letter, but a bit more formally, from the Earl of Hertford to Henry VIII. The places in Rulewater were actually listed. On the Water of Rule, Rule Spittal, Bedrule, Rulewood, the Waddles, Crossview, Donnelly's, Fetton, that's Fulton now, Wesley's, 2 Walk Mills, Tromby Hill, Dupligus, in total 12. So this is what was burnt. Now that's not 12 towers. 2 of these are Walk Mills. There are mills, and lots of mills there, and we don't know which ones were the mills. So that really gave us something to think about, because we now had a load of names, and we had this old map of DuPont's of the valley, and we had the modern maps. And one of the things that was striking was that some of these places are still there, and place names are still there, or they're recognisable from both the DuPont map and the modern map, but some of them we couldn't quite work out. 2 of them we've never worked out if they were really in Rulewater. That's Tromby Hill and Dupligus, which might be Double Dykes, it might be Douglas, we don't know. We've never found anything that corresponds to them in the Valley of Rulewater. There's a place called Tromby Hill over on the other side of the Teviot, so there's maybe been a bit of a muddle about place names. Whoever the scribe was that was writing all this down may have mixed up between all these hundreds and hundreds of names each day. He may have made some mistakes. But the others, we think we have a good idea which they might be, and some are definitely established, and some are actually recorded by Archaeology and authenticated by them as well. So we felt comfortable about them. So then and I've got a list here now of what the ones we think might be. I'll just read that just now. we had the story. This valley was devastated. These place names are mostly in the lower part of the valley. They don't go right up into the hills. So the parts it's a bit closer to the Teviot. And we had a pretty good idea where some of these places were. In fact, we know about some of them. Fetton, it says there, it's actually Fulton. Fulton Tower is actually listed, and it's actually still above ground, a little bit of it. So we knew that one. And Rulewater, we knew where that was. Bedrule is a village and a kirk. And the castle of Bedrule was actually was well known and was backed out by part of the audience. I'll come on to that in a minute. And the other ones, some of them we had a good idea from the maps, but weren't absolutely certain. So some things we were quite sure about, some unsure, and that partly stimulated the interest, and we reckon would also stimulate the interest of other people to try and find out more about it, which was really the object of this whole project, was to get people interested and get people involved to find out more about the very rich cultural heritage of this area, which is the borders is very little underappreciated and very little valued. So anyway, how were we going to do anything? There we were, with no relevant skills and no money. So we applied to various sources for some money, and we did get various sums of money from some from South of Scotland Enterprise, and then thanks to Boris, I think, we got some money, the Build Back Better Borders money, which I think is Boris money, and we got about 12,000 from them, and we were able to give that, or pay Archaeology Scotland then to come and work with us on this, because they had the expertise and the tools, and they also had a project they could provide part funding to this. So that got Archaeology Scotland involved, and they were very interested in the whole thing and wanted to get this mystery solved. We got some money later from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and some out of Potty of Denham, Potty, Hopkirk, local communities that have been very interested and very involved in the project as a whole, and some very small sums of money from the campaign, which only had very small sums of money. So anyway, we raised over the period, and we're talking about from 2020 to 2023, funding from these various sources. Archaeology Scotland's Adopt a Monument programme engaged with us, and they are continuing to work with us on this. In fact, last week, Kieran Manship of Archaeology Scotland was down telling us about what had been going on this last year, when we've been doing some excavation at one of the sites, and also some of the analysis work that Archaeology Scotland are able to do in their laboratories on some of the materials that they have found at the site. So that's still ongoing. We got a lot of, and again, Archaeology Scotland have somebody who is allowed to work with children and who's very experienced at organising school groups to come along. So we got school groups from 7 of the schools, secondary schools in the border, who came along and participated in excavation, and right up till now, and workshops. Bedrule Castle is opposite this line of cottages, which have a very good village hall at the end of it. It was just an ideal site for workshops about archaeological techniques, about local history, and all the things that were relevant to what was going on out in the field. So there are a series of workshops, and we actually had a meeting there last week. That trained a volunteer team who are still working, but also all these children had, I think we had over 150 kids we've had, and maybe haven't got all the totals for this year. And I'll show a picture of them in a minute. They thoroughly enjoyed it. We got lots of coverage in the local press. We've, I think, had features about every month in one paper or another in the area about what's been going on. And we talked to a lot of the communities, to community council meetings, and also put on one or two separate presentations as well, which kept people in the picture of what was going on and increased the general interest and understanding of the area, and asking questions. So it's stimulated what we were thinking about doing next. We made, because most of this was done during the period of COVID, the main part done during the period of COVID, and that caused enormous problems because there were periods when we all tried to organise things and then we weren't allowed to do them. But between these things, we managed to get quite a lot done, both on the excavation sites, but we also made a reenactment video of the 1545 raid, and this was all with volunteer help. There's a group which some of you may have come across, Les Amis d'Anneau, who do reenactments of everything, knights on horses and battles and things, and they're based in a settlement just along from Rulewater, and they were stuck. They couldn't go out and do anything. And we went along and talked to them and said, I wonder if there's anything that we could do with you. And they said, well, we can't go anywhere. Normally we take all our horses and we go off and do things, but we've got 40 acres here of rough ground, and it's quite amazing what you can do with photography. So we reenacted much of the raid on the Rulewater on their ground, and accompanied it with extracts from the letter written and read by an actor who lives in Selkirk to explain what was going on. And we rolled that video out, and I think it's still on our website in actual fact at the moment. And that was great fun, and again it involved a lot of people who were very interested and who brought skills to it as well, but also learnt a lot about the area from doing this. And more recently, because we started worrying about, we've done quite a lot of archaeology, but we haven't done enough on the history of the area, the written history. So we managed to raise £5,000 to get Professor Richard Oram of Stirling to do an evaluation of the historic record, which they completed about 10 months ago, and it's on our website as well, and that complements what we've been doing in the archaeology, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we also started a programme, which I'll talk about at the end, to save Bedrule Kirk, which is an important part of this whole story. And of course, the Church of Scotland is selling off 30% of its properties over the next few years, and Bedrule Kirk is going to be one of them. And we very much would like to see it being put to some appropriate use. Now, let's have a look at the excavations. This, well, not excavation, this is Fulton Tower, believe it or not. There's not very much left, but there's a lot more than there is in most of the towers. Most of these towers were either left after they were razed and something else was built, or they have, in later, more peaceful times, the stones have been recycled in other buildings, but they have left lumps and bumps, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these areas in the borders where you see these mysterious lumps and bumps where there were buildings before, and you wonder what they were. And that's what most of the 12 towers are like, in fact. But this one, which is a listed building, is above ground, and it's surrounded by very interesting lumps and bumps. Because it's listed, that restricted very much what we could do at short notice, and also the landowner, while he was quite happy for people to come and look at it, didn't really want anything more to happen. Landowners generally are not that keen on having listed buildings or having anything to do anything with listed buildings because it can turn out to be problematic for them. But anyway, here in Manship, who's there on the right, there's Kieran, is explaining there how they're surveying, how they're going to survey this ruin and what they can learn from what is left of it. And it has 2 or 3 gun slips. It's got the basis of probably a circular stair over to the right. And from the nature of the stonework and the remains of the mortar, you can date it and have a good idea that it would probably be a 2-storey building very similar to many others in the borders. We get quite a good idea of that. The rest of it, however, they are still actually surveying that whole area with the various geophysical techniques that archaeologists use nowadays to try and work out this quite extensive area, which has clearly had quite a few buildings in it, and it will be very interesting to find out the extent and the nature of the buildings. At this stage, I think we had one or two volunteers who came along, and several people from Archaeology Scotland. Roger Curtis was becoming increasingly involved with this, and that was very helpful because he worked for Historic Environment Scotland, and they were a bit stuck because this is during the COVID era. He was able to rope in some of their facilities to help out a bit with it as well. So we got started on that. That was the first part. I think it was the second try before we actually managed to go there because of all the stops and starts with lockdowns. The next place we decided to look at was Bedrule Castle. Now, Piers Dixon, who's somewhere out there in the dark, surveyed it in 1984. It's a very interesting bump. This was taken, I think this was Richard Strathie's drone photograph that we have here. You can see a little bit of wall along there. And the problem here is the wall actually runs like that, and on the other side of the wall it's all a very nice field which has been well ploughed, so there's no visible signs of the castle on the other side of the wall. However, Kieran Manchip and his team are now have now done quite a lot of surveying with geophysical techniques now, and are beginning to work out a bit more about what's on the other side of the wall to add to what we've been finding out about what's on this side of the wall. Now in this one, they've had quite a lot of excavations here. I think there were some this year. There's been each year from 21, 22. 4 years, no, 3 years I think we've had some excavation here, and in the early stages, started to identify edges and the pile a lot of stones that had been knocked down. It had been observed earlier that a great deal of stone from the castle had been used to build that wall that we see there, and it's a long wall. So, and someone had worked very hard to take a lot of that castle down. Again, coming to looking at the historical evidence, the records indicate that it gradually fell out of use in the 16th century. It's not clear if it was rebuilt after the 1545 burning. And one of the things that they're doing at the moment is analysing some charcoal from the site to try and identify the dates at which it was burnt, because there's probably been more than one, and that this turbulent part of the borders, and that it was not uncommon for buildings to be burnt down. And so that's one of the things that they're trying to ascertain at the moment. And they've worked out quite a lot of the predicted parts of the building from that, but not the initial ones. I would have said were a bit disappointing, but they didn't disappoint the school kids who came and helped. This time we had all the schools come and help, and this is a bunch of kids from Newcastleton Primary actually digging away there. And I recall very well Jeffrey walked around at the back there and said, "Have you found anything there?" And someone jumped up and said, "Worms." And I'm not sure if that lot found any more at that point. But progressively they managed to find out where the boundaries were and what looked promising, and start to move back in time a little bit in the building. Now the most interesting things have been coming up in this year. Now they've progressed to the point where they actually they found some post holes just outside the boundary, and there is some evidence that there might have been an older building there before. This is about 13th century, There may have been an older building, this may have been a long occupied site, and that's one thing that's being progressively looked at. But also they came on some very beautiful, and very nicely fashioned stone wall with well-cut stone, and an area of perfect paving, 6 feet by 2 feet 6, very regular, and with a step a bit up that might have been up to a window, all in very high quality stone, which from which it was very obvious that this was a high status building, or how Kieran described it, and had, for the records, probably been a fortified mansion house rather than a real major defensive fort. Again, we're talking about a valley which is a little bit off the beaten track, and you wouldn't have expected major fortifications there, and there's no evidence there ever were major fortifications, but in those days most of these towers were fortified to some degree. So this was probably a substantial mansion house, a fortified mansion house. The records suggest that Edward I actually spent the night here way back in what would that be, the 13th? That would be the 13th century, the early days, and clearly always a major house in the valley, and until the later part of the 16th century. There's some doubt as to whether it was the initial major castle in the area, because on the other side of the river is just down there, it's right on it's on a high point. On the other side of the river, upstream a bit, there is a very striking motte and bailey with nothing left on top of it, which is known as Fast Castle, again is recorded as such, which is probably a little bit older than Bedrule Castle, and may have been, and there's various evidence to suggest that it was the principal castle in the area, but the record is very unclear beyond after the 13th century in actual fact, so we don't know much about that, and that's another of these things that we need to really be looking into a little bit more than we have done so far. The first record actually after the 13th century was 1519, when a woman called Janet Kerr came into ownership of that, and she was married to a Turnbull, and this valley became heavily identified with the Turnbulls. And in the early days it belonged to the Cummins, and then it went to Douglases, but then for a long period it appeared to be the Turnbulls, and they very much were a dominant group within this valley, and also on the other side of the Teviot there. And the Turnbulls still regard this as very much their origin. There's an international Turnbull society, and there's a newsletter, the Bullseye, published at the moment from Australia by someone called Ken Turnbull, who's always asking us for more to put in the magazine about Rulewater and the Bedrule Castle and all that we're doing here. And the interest from the Turnbull clan internationally is very, very considerable, and to the point of actually visiting Rulewater. And quite frequently, quite a few of them have actually written to us and said, I visited in 1995, and tell me this, and if I come back, and so on. And in fact, we had a visit last year, which I will talk about very, very shortly. So, in addition to the excavation here, and most of the work with schools has been done on this site, partly because the landowners who live in the old manse down the hill are very happy for that. It's quite accessible, and this is one of the problems in looking at any of these towers. Most of them are in awkward sites. They're either in somebody's backyard, or they're built into somebody's current farmhouse, or they're very, very remote from any road that you could reasonably expect people to get to. So finding a site like this that you can the landowners are happy for you to do some excavation work, and it's quite easy of access, and where there's a village hall nearby that you can go to eat your lunch and also have your workshops. That makes it a very good site to look at. However, it's by no means the only one in this area that the team have been looking at. The latest one is up quite a bit up the river. There's a site called Swanshield, which Roger Curtis discovered, which had never been reported before, and they did a little bit of surveying of that, and they did again surveying of the Bonchester Hill site. And Bonchester Hill is interesting because not only was there one of these buildings on the side of the hill, but the top of the hill, like almost all of our hills around here, had an Iron Age fort on it. I think just about every hill in the borders has an Iron Age or a Bronze Age fort on it. But there are layers of history and on that site to explore in the longer term. And our interest at the moment really is that with this area around the castle and the kirk and the hall is a very good focal point from which to do work and to radiate out to other sites and other periods of time as well. And I think one of the things that was very striking, and I only saw this slide last week, so unfortunately I haven't got it yet to show you this beautiful stonework surrounded by all these stones. It does remind one very much that when you knock down an arch and all you've got is a pile of rubble, but an arch is an awful lot more than the stones that went to make it. It consists not only of the stones, but the relationships between the stones and the idea that's gone into creating that. And in this valley, what we're really trying to understand is the relationships between the different sorts of houses and families that occupied them, and the things that they were doing and have been doing over the centuries, the relationships within this community that has held it together in such a resilient way over such a long period, in spite of the devastation of 1545. The village, the area rather, has gradually recovered from that, and many of the sites beside them have been rebuilt. Many of the same families have stayed there. Other people have moved in as well, but some of the same families have stayed there. And the resilience from earliest times right down to the present in an area that has suffered so much turbulence and devastation is very striking and very interesting and relevant to our current times. In the period 1545, this whole area must have been was very tribal. It was very unlaw-abiding. One of the records is of James IV in 1510, I think, coming through. And Turnbull clan were notably turbulent and troublemakers, and he summoned a large number of them and dispersed them around the country. I think he did some hanging at Jedburgh as well, but a lot of the Turnbulls he dispersed to other parts of the country because they caused so much trouble. It was a very difficult time, and only occasionally did the king or whoever managed to impose any sort of law on the borders. There's these kids having a great time. It was mostly secondary school kids, but this group were so interested that one of the mothers brought them all up on a Saturday morning to join the dig, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think that one of the things about the various funds that were all raised on the back of the story of what had happened and the idea of exploring it and using that as an educational method to teach people about the area, to give young people skills as well. And somebody said, but they're not all going to grow up to be archaeologists, and that isn't really the point, because archaeologists use a broad range of technologies, all of which are in use in the construction industry. So the actual techniques themselves are very valuable, but also the experience of working as a team, of noting and analysing and recording, and all these various transferable skills are picked up in days of work like this as well. And we were very, very aware of how much the kids were actually picking up. Kieran, as part of the exercise, in fact, did circulate questionnaires, got feedback from the kids and from their teachers as well, to ascertain the extent to which they were picking up information, ideas and skills, and had very, very strong positive feedback from all of the schools involved about that. And I think that it has in the long term left a very strong impression on all the children that were there, and their teachers, and some of the other young people who were involved as well. And though they may not have found pots of gold or any of these things that one would love to find when one is digging around a site like that, they were extraordinarily excited by what they did find. I was sometimes worried that they would be disappointed when all they would find would be some very small piece of some broken off something that Kieran could identify had been used by people in the 16th century. But they weren't. They were delighted by that, and they were very interested in the idea that there had been people living here before, long ago, and it had been rather different. Not completely different, but in a lot of ways rather different. And the idea of these hills as having been continuously occupied for long periods of time, but continuously changing with these the different occupations, still continuously changing, was something that had not struck them, but was beginning to come home to them. And I think is a sort of thing that does stick with them and with people generally. We, the team, who didn't know anything about the archaeology and very little about the history of the area, like everyone, had looked at these hills and seen these odd undulations and bumps and realised this had been made by man, but why and who and when? And when you're taken round by an archaeologist, you can say, these are old peat diggings. This is drainage from 200 years ago, and this is these lines down from the top of the hill, and that's Iron Age agriculture. You start to learn what these lines and bumps signify, and then it makes it more interesting. But it also gives you an idea of what things were like. And with the kids, we began to hear them talking about how it must have been, and quite clearly their imagination becomes populated in a way by being out there doing that and talking about it in a way that sitting in the classroom reading about it in a book, if they ever read about history and the borders in a book, it doesn't get to you quite as effectively in that way at all, I don't think, really. So, at the moment, Archaeology Scotland is hoping to continue. They got money up to February, and they're applying for more money, and I'll say a bit more about the more money thing. And they've got a lot of analysis that they are continuing to do and continuing to feed back to us what the information that they're collecting from various measurements that they have made on these different sites. We're trying to link up Richard Oram and Tom Turpey's archival evaluation with the archaeological evidence and other physical data, including LiDAR. There's lots of LiDAR studies of the area now. And LiDAR is a very powerful technique, whereby it's an aerial technique, but rather than just aerial photography, it can actually penetrate to some degree into the ground and give a better picture of things than simple aerial photography. The story as told by Richard Oram and Tom Turpey has a lot around about the very early stages, and they go back to the 11th century. But once you get to the late 13th century, there starts to be a big gap until you get to 16th century. And if we could find out a bit more about that, it would be very helpful to try and understand what life was like. Because we like to construct the story of this very resilient community and find out more about the relationships between these different households and how they operated together and how it helped them survive over these very difficult times. We'll look a bit more at the recovery story, and there's a lot more documentation of that, so that's going to be a bit easier, I think. One of the big things at the moment, though, is the Bedrule Kirk's future. And Bedrule Kirk has been quite central to this. Let me go. There's Bedrule Kirk. It was that's the current version built on the original site, a 1,000-year-old sacred site. But there's a couple of Viking hogback tombstones, so it goes back a very long way. It was rebuilt by Alan Bailey's grandfather in the late 19th century, a little bit bigger than it had been before. And that's another view of it. Surrounded by a graveyard, and the gravestones, you can't read most of them, but very, very happenstantially, a lady in the 1990s went round and cleaned them all off and read them all and recorded it all. The Family History Society in Ghana has a little £2 book that gives you all of that information. And then I was a bit worried, because that was very helpful, but you know, where's number one, where's number two? But Alan has managed to find an old drawing that somebody has done that actually identifies where number 1, 2, 3, 4 and what's written on most of them, so that we can actually work out exactly what every gravestone has. And this is very important to people. Last year, the Archaeological Society of America came over, and there about 10 of them came over to visit the area. They were here for a week, and one day they came to Bedrule, and they had a service at Bedrule Kirk. The minister, who is a very nice lady called Rachel Wilson, after she'd done a service down in Denham, came up and did a church service for them in Bedrule Kirk, which was very touching. But before the service, I'd talked to quite a few people, and there were 1 or 2 gravestones we could read, but they would really have liked to find the ones of their own ancestors. So we're really keen to get this information organised in a way that people can work out exactly where their ancestors are. It's very important to people. It's the sort of thing that it's one of the things that makes us think that the Bedrule Kirk could be a centre, could remain operational as a church, but not being run by the Church of Scotland, a building where anyone could be married or baptised or whatever, but could do other things. You can actually do quite a lot of other things in churches, and at the moment we've been running an effort to find out what people think you might do in a church, because it's quite easy, in fact, to raise money to buy a church. It'll probably go for about £60,000. You get money to make capital improvements. The big problem comes when you've got to keep it running for year after year. And Alan Bailey, who is himself a surveyor, reckons it's probably about £10,000 a year for this particular kirk, which is quite, let's see, it's in quite good condition, and it's not too complicated. But 10,000 a year is quite a bit of money, so you've got to think up things to do that will generate that sort of cash, and you also need to think of things that are appropriate to do in a church. And in fact, there are several charities now. This is further ahead in England than in Scotland, as you can imagine. These things usually are. People working out what you can do in a church. They can keep it as a church, but raise enough money to maintain it, so that you have this place. It's a sacred place for many people to visit, and still retain it with doing useful and interesting things, music, concerts as well, all sorts of things you can do in a church. So that's something that Alan is carrying forward at the moment as a member of the congregation, trying to get a bunch of people together. Then there's the question of, yes, walks and cycle paths. We've got a cycle path worked out with one of our team members and the secretary of the Hoyt Cycle Club worked out a route for bikes to visit, be able to see all the sites in Rulewater and also link up to Hoyt and link into the main routes. Walks, we have there's a lady who has been working very hard working at walks between not just Bedrule Kirk but a lot of the other churches in the area that are suffering the same sort of fate. In fact, all these nice little rural churches, walks between them, and she's mapping them out and actually working out what's a short walk, what's an easy walk, where can you park, where can you do this, so that, and linking them into the long distance walks in the area, of which there are several now, so that people can include them in long distance walks, or you can go for a short walk, and anything that you like. And we're also putting together more online and hard copy information, but that's where things get a bit difficult because the campaign, sadly our campaign was unsuccessful, so we're wrapping up the charity that allowed us to apply for funding for things, and the business of our website, we're going to have to take down the website eventually. We'll have all the stuff, and anybody who's interested will be able to find out all the information that I've been talking about on our website just now for the next few months, and after that you can contact me and we will be having it. But at the moment we don't have a permanent home for any of that, or for any of the other stuff that we're collecting at the moment, or for stuff about Bedrule Kirk, which we will hope to build up over time. So funding is a big issue, and in these straitened times, I think that all your organisations and all these smaller societies around the borders will have the same problem, that we're coming into a difficult time where it has become harder to get the small sums of money that we need to keep our various things looked after and working. And I'd be very interested in any ideas people have of how we can work together perhaps to help make that more possible for everyone. This is just a last view that I took last week down, that's up the valley, no that's not, wait a minute, that's the one, that's up the valley towards the hills from the Kirk in December. So that's it then. So thank you very much everyone, and you people.
Jane, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for such a fascinating discussion on really a relatively unexplored part of the border. So thank you very much, and doesn't it just show to all of us what a community can do when the different strands of that community can come together. So a really, really great address. Thank you very much indeed. Now, as is usual with the Tweeddale Society's talks, I'm throwing this open to questions for the last few minutes. Now, I got a little bit of a ticking off the last time in that I allowed people to ask questions of the speaker without having a microphone in their hands. So if you've got a question, please wait for one of the volunteers to come round with the microphone. If you've got the microphone in your hand, that means that everybody in the auditorium will be able to hear your question. So thank you very much indeed. So shall we kick off with the first question?
Is this the right way to go? Yeah. Can you please tell me what the towers were for? What the towers were for? Why were they built?
Well, this part of the world, the borders generally, has suffered a great deal in terms of tribal strife and as well as invasions from the south. And so people have been very strongly motivated to build defensive style structures in farms. Most of these buildings that we're looking at are farms, in fact, of various sizes. And the valley that I live in, which is down near the border, there's a little town here, a little town there, a little town here, and most of them are just lumps and bumps. One is built into a house, but every single farm had a tower, and some of them are quite tiny towers that they would retreat into when the neighbours came reeling, or presumably when armies came over the borders. I think the valley we live in, the V6-V57, and Bonnie Prince Charlie camped in the field opposite our house on his way to wherever he was going at that point. And many armies have passed through this part of the world, not all of them friendly by any manner of means, but also the tribal warfare between different reaving families went on over a long period of time in this area, and people had to defend themselves.
Did you know there's another fast castle in Scotland?
Oh, I know. It's quite famous. I don't know why this one's called Fast Castle.
It has complicated some historians in the past because they have the two of them mixed up.
Yes.
Anyone else?
Jane, thank you very much indeed. Clearly your address has been so good that we've only had a couple of questions. Sorry.
Could you tell us something about the stones? Those?
Could you just
Something about the stones. Those look sort of Victorian, they don't look terribly old.
Oh, they're still burying people in that graveyard. Yes, there are bunches of flowers on some of the graves in recent burials. but it goes very far back, and the ones that are recorded are just over the last 300 years or so. But there would be more below them if we searched.
Are you actually allowed to do a dig in the graveyard?
Oh no, you can't dig in the graveyard, no. And the graveyard, this is one of the problems. These churches come up for sale. The graveyard mustn't be touched. It's the responsibility of the council to look after it. Why anybody wants to live in a converted church with graves all around it, I don't know. It wouldn't approach me, but people do. And we are concerned that we wouldn't see that as an appropriate use. But there's actually an architecture firm in Edinburgh that specialises in converting these churches into houses, so we're worried that they'll step in, because they're very cheap to buy, but there can be very awkward buildings to make livable, and this one doesn't have a water supply. It's actually on a mound. It has no water supply. You'd have to drill a well. Can't drill a well in the graveyard. What do? Drill it outside, bring water overhead. It doesn't have any sanitation. It does have electricity. It's a heating system, but it's falling apart.
Well, thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I mean, it's clearly an absolutely shocking event, the rough wooing. And I mean, it wasn't unprecedented, of course. You know, back to the Normans who sort of devastated England between the Humber and the Tyne. And it took maybe 200 years before the communities recovered to any extent. I wonder if you have any idea how long it took the communities around your area to recover.
There's much more data later in the 16th century, not immediately, but there's quite a lot later in the 16th century, and one of the curators at the Royal Scottish Museums actually did a PhD on the topic. And I think it's quite remarkable how quickly people did build back. They had, there were places there that had been burnt 2 or 3 years earlier. They were accustomed to having to deal with difficult times. And I don't know if they had storage places up in the hills as well, where they maybe kept stuff. Who can tell? We haven't come across anything like that. But they were accustomed to dealing with great difficulties. And I think the recovery period obviously wasn't an overnight thing at all. But they built back, and by the end of the 16th century, the Fulton Tower had been rebuilt. Some of the other ones had been rebuilt, some had built something else nearby, and they were farming away. Well, you had to farm away because they had to eat.
Yeah. You don't know if there was if they had a policy of killing all the men, for example. That was, like William the Conqueror, made sure all the men were killed that they could find.
I think they were told to get rid of all the winter provisions and lay waste thoroughly, and they made also that was in writing, and no doubt there was an expectation they'd kill as many healthy young men as possible.
Thanks very much.
Do we have any more questions before I bid farewell to Jane? Right, Jane, thank you very much indeed for, as I said, a very, very fascinating address to the Tweeddale Society, along with the Archaeological Society of Peebles as well. So once again, thank you very, very much for a very So it only remains for me to thank you all again for coming out this evening, to wish you a very, very happy Christmas and a great New Year in the area. And we look forward to seeing you on the second Tuesday of January. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming along.
Watch the old slip when you go out, because it's quite cold.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Fascinating. Really good. Really, really good.
What amazes me is how easy it is to stimulate young people's imagination. Our local village, the village school, 4 kids in the reception class. Last year there were 4 kids in the reception class. And the village is just 8. And that's a huge
I did a lot of research on the other fast gas. Actually, I come from High Galloway, and that's where I come from Bedrule. Back in history, a long time ago when I did this, one of the battles near Berwick, where the Scots had been, there was a single combat between an English knight and a Scottish knight. The English knight won, the Scottish knight was returned. And that's where something got mixed up between 2 fast gases.